Catholics are currently in the midst of the Christmas season. Now, a lot of people tend to confuse Advent and the Christmas season. During Advent, we are spiritually preparing ourselves for Christmas. The Christmas season itself doesn't actually start until the feast day of Christmas itself. And whereas during Advent, we are spiritually preparing ourselves for Christmas, starting with the Christmas season, we as Catholics are meant to explore or meditate upon the spiritual and moral implications of the Incarnation in a more direct or intense manner. Thus, Catholics should be spending the Christmas season examining the moral and spiritual implications of the doctrine of the Incarnation. Now, as someone who follows a lot of theologians and religious commentators and religious leaders online, a lot of theological content ends up in my social media feed. And one thing that showed up frequently in the immediate lead up to Christmas was the following screenshot showing a comment made a few years ago by the Protestant pastor and apologist Tim Keller, and a response to this comment made by another famous Protestant pastor and apologist, James White. Keller wrote, quote, "The God of the universe became a wiggling baby in order to get closer to you," unquote. To which White responded, "No, sir. The second person in the Trinity took on a perfect human nature first and foremost to bring glory to the triune God in the redemption of a completely unworthy people upon whom the triune God had decreed mercy and grace from eternity past. That's not the same as getting close to you." One person who posted a copy of this screenshot included, in connection with the screenshot of this conversation, the comment, "Average Protestant discussion." The implication here is that Keller supposedly represents the more modern, liberal strain of Protestantism that emphasizes the interpersonal relationships between God and humanity and the notion of Christ, or the stories surrounding Christ, as laying down a general model for a new Christian way of life over a doctrinally well-defined and strictly adhered to understanding of the nature of God. White, on the other hand, represents the more conservative or reactionary view of Christianity that emphasizes rooting all theological statements or spiritual sentiments in a well-defined and consistently applied series of doctrines concerning the nature of God, one that emphasizes the transcendence and sovereignty of God, particularly in the realm of salvation. Thus, for White, the emphasis is to be placed on the notion that God did not have to save us. As one with absolute authority, no one can force him to save us, and as an all-powerful, all-knowing, immortal being, he needs nothing from us. Thus, the Incarnation, as the means of humanity's salvation, together with the cross and resurrection, was done first and foremost to give expression to the glory of God. God chose to save us from sin, to be close with us in the Incarnation as a way to glorify himself. That is the primary reason behind the Incarnation. On the other hand, Keller would place the emphasis on the notion that God is love. And the highest expression of love is in self-giving or self-sacrificial love. If God is the source of our love, then that means that God is the highest expression of this self-giving love. An attempt to showcase this element of his nature, the notion that God loves us so much that he was willing to go to any extreme in order to save us from sin, that is what motivated the Incarnation. One comment that I saw pop up over and over again in response to this discussion between Keller and White was, "Why not both?" Now, this may sound like a theological cop-out, or a sort of faux sophistication, Saying both sides are correct in their own way or both sides are wrong may be interpreted by some as a lazy attempt at being balanced and unbiased. But I do believe here that both sides have only a partial image of what the Incarnation is all about. And this partial or one-sided image is derived from placing too much emphasis on one element or another. And this is only made worse by the nature of modern online discourse. When you're restricted in terms of how much you can write or post, or when things like tone of voice or nuance don't always show through, it leaves a lot lacking and forces us to talk in overly simplistic, overly straightforward, overly black and white, usually very exaggerated manners in order to make a point. Christian theology is more sophisticated than that. Both Keller and White know this, and that's why, if you were to push either of them far enough, Keller will eventually at some point start sounding like White, and White will eventually start sounding a lot like Keller. And by that I mean that you can't separate the fact that the Incarnation, and by extension everything involved in our salvation, serves to glorify God, and yet God chose to glorify himself through this radical expression of love, which is not shocking if you understand the divine nature. It's not that God needs us, or that there was any metaphysical necessity that moved God to save us, or that anyone forced God to save us, but that the defining feature of the divine nature is love. In fact, as I said in one recent video, God isn't just loving, he is love. And so it makes sense why God would decree that his glory be manifest through his love. In fact, I would even go another step further and say that, from an ontological perspective, you can't separate the divine love from the divine glory. Divine glory is a byproduct of a thing expressing its perfection. That is, its goodness, its beauty, its truth, its majesty, its virtue, its wisdom. Because the divine glory is not dependent on anything outside of itself, it would not in any way be lessened by God choosing not to love us. And this is something that is often overlooked in more liberal Christian discourse. The thing is, we can't act as if God expressing his love towards us is incidental to the divine glory. As a 20th century Catholic mystical writer, Father Gabriel of Mary Magdalene wrote, quote, "The Incarnation is the greatest of God's works, because it is the supreme manifestation of the merciful love of God, and the work which above all others glorifies him. And it glorifies him precisely in reference to the charity which is his very essence." Unquote. There is no separating the divine glory from the divine essence, and there is no separating the divine essence from its perfections, including and especially the divine love, the divine goodness, and the divine mercy. These qualities, as found in God, are not distinct from the divine essence. Since God is the source of these perfections, they are part and parcel of the very fabric of the divine essence itself. They are not things distinct from the divine essence, which we predicate onto the divine essence. They are merely different ways of describing or naming the divine essence. Traditionally, Catholics have taught that part of the nature of goodness is that it is fundamentally communicative in nature. Goodness doesn't reach its full potential independent of sharing itself with others. Concerning the divine goodness, it's not that God's goodness wasn't already perfect prior to God sharing it with us in the act of creation and redemption. Rather, because divine goodness is perfect, because it is the source and standard of goodness, it makes sense why it would communicate itself to us, why it would find ways to make its presence felt among us in more and more direct and intense manners, including through the Incarnation. Thus, to sum everything up, God did not become man out of metaphysical necessity. That is, he didn't act in such a way that it was logically impossible for him to not have acted or to have acted differently. He didn't act because he needed us. And yet, he did act in order to make manifest his glory. Nonetheless, to say God became incarnate in order to make his glory manifest to his creation, and then to stop there, makes God seem like an egotistical dictator. You need to couple statements like God acts for the sake of his own greater glory with the realization that the divine glory is intimately and inextricably connected with divine goodness, with divine love, with divine mercy, and all the other moral perfections of God, and in fact, the glory of God is the product of his perfections. Therefore, to say that God so chose to manifest his glory in and through various expressions of his love is not an arbitrary decision on God's part. It is rather the modus operandi of divine action, the motivating factor behind everything he does. God became present to us out of love, in order to manifest his love to us in such a way, in such an intense and direct manner that, if we respond in faith and charity, we will be brought up into this love and be moved to love God in return. Thus, as Catholics often pray during Mass during the Christmas season, "For in the mystery of the Word made flesh, a new light of your glory has shone upon the eyes of our mind, so that, as we recognize in him God made visible, we may be caught up through him in love of things invisible."